Thomas Anderson White was born in Unley, in Adelaide, in 1886. We don't know much about his early life. We know that he was an agent for the Adelaide Steamship Company. We know that he played lacrosse, and he played it at a very competitive level from 1908 until 1912. But it was for rowing that he was most regarded in the state of South Australia. He joined the Mercantile Rowing Club in 1903. He was very, very popular, and he transferred to the Adelaide Rowing Club in 1904, and he represented South Australia in competitive rowing in every part of Australia. It was said of Tom White in 1912 that he was the greatest oarsman that South Australia had ever produced. 3 weeks after the declaration of the First World War, on the 4th of August 1914, Tom White joined the AIF. And as with many South Australians, he went into the 10th Battalion. He then embarked, and as they did, went to Egypt, and we have a photograph of him at the Australian War Memorial with him sitting on the pyramids with his great friend Lance Rhodes, where also he rowed in preparation for what would become the deployment to Gallipoli. His great friend also was Arthur Blackburn, and Blackburn had been awarded a Victoria Cross at Pozières the following year in 1916. And for the Gallipoli landing, Tom White had volunteered to row one of the boats. Blackburn wrote in his diary that the most dangerous position of all was for the men who were rowing, because they had nowhere that was safe. They couldn't even crouch down in the bottom of the boat. He said such was the regard that officers had for the risk of ordering the men to expose themselves to rowing that they hesitated to offer the orders. And that finally, that Tom White had grasped the importance of the situation, and as everybody had expected, he volunteered to row. Blackburn further wrote in his diary that on that morning, in the pre-dawn darkness, that Tom White rowed vigorously toward the shore, but he laughed and joked all of the way. But as the boat hit the shingle, he slumped to the side, and he had been shot through the pelvis, and he died on a hospital ship somewhere between Gallipoli and Alexandria, and he was not 29. His name is recorded on the Lone Pine Memorial, of course on the Gallipoli Peninsula. Blackburn subsequently wrote that the poor fellow died without firing a shot, but it was largely due to the courage and endurance of Tom White and his fellow rowers that so many were landed that day with so few losses. The great 19th century English philosopher John Stuart Mill wrote that he regarded there being two essential preconditions for a nation to exist. The first, he said, was that people would want to be governed together, that they would want to be governed as one people. The second he regarded as an essential precondition was a commonality of feeling, a sympathy of fellowship that is deeply rooted in language and literature and history. For Australia, in the latter part of the 19th century, over a generation and a half, Australians, then members of these 6 colonies, anguished, vigorously debated, and went through an enormous amount of hand-wringing. And then finally in 1901, we became the Commonwealth of Australia. But it wasn't until 1914, with the enlistment of Australian men and women into the Australian Nursing Corps, with Australians in an Australian uniform, sent overseas with an Australian flag, that Australia's story began largely to evolve from the challenges of those who had arrived at the First Fleet, the devastation that it had for Indigenous Australians, and the agricultural and mining history that Australia forged in the 19th century. Every nation has its own story, and this is ours. Charles Bean was Australia's First World War official historian. He landed with the troops at Gallipoli on the 25th of April 1915. He remained with them at the front until the very end of the war. He carried a Turkish bullet in his right leg from the August offensive in 1915 for the rest of his life. Of all of the things that Bean wrote and recorded in his diaries and the 4 volumes of the official history which he wrote of the First World War, to me the one that says it most and says it best is an incident before the assault on Lone Pine. Lone Pine was a battle which commenced on the 4th of August 1915. It was a forward assault, but the fighting was by bayonets and bombs in the trenches, tunnels and galleries, and at its end would be 2,000 Australian casualties and 7,000 Turks, and 7 Australians would be awarded a Victoria Cross. In the pre-dawn darkness before the assault in the forward trench, Bean recorded the following incident. An Australian soldier arriving said to the men in the darkness in the trench, "Jim here?" And a voice came back from the fire step, "Yeah, right here, Bill." "Do you blokes mind moving up a piece?" asked the first voice. "Him and me are mates, and we're going over together." At the end of it all, when Charles Bean sat at his desk with his typewriter and a blank page out at Tuggeranong at the homestead where he wrote the official history, in seeking to find the words to summarise it all, he said, and this will be the very first thing that you see when you come to the redeveloped First World War galleries that will open in late November this year. "What these men did, nothing can alter now. The good and the bad, the greatness and the smallness of their story. It rises, as it will always rise, above the mists of time, a monument to great-hearted men, and for their nation a possession forever." We are who we are, not because or only of our institutions or the decision of our forebears to form the Commonwealth of Australia. We are defined who we are by our values and our beliefs, our triumphs and our failures, our heroes and villains, the adversities that we have faced as a nation and how we have managed them. These are the things that shape the way we relate to one another and see our place in the world. We were, almost 100 years ago, a population of just over 4.5 million. 1 million men were of an age that could volunteer, and from a nation that twice rejected conscription, of which our generation should be immensely proud. 413,000 volunteered. 330,000 were sent overseas. At the end of the 4 years, 62,000 would be dead. Another 60,000 would be dead within 10 years of returning, and 120,000 of them would be on disability pensions for entirely different reasons from a number of the 850,000 that are currently on it now. Such were the wounds that were inflicted on this nation, and these events that shaped the nation that we are today. It was at Pozières in France in July 1916, toward the end of the month, when Charles Bean, having seen 23,000 casualties in 6 weeks, wrote in his diary, "Many a man lying out there at Pozières, and in the low scrub at Gallipoli, with his poor, tired senses barely working through the fever of his brain, has thought in his last moments, well, it's over, but in Australia, they will be proud of this." About a week later, a mortally wounded Australian soldier asked Bean, "Will they remember me in Australia?" And that started Bean in his conversation with a man called John Trelaw, who'd been a junior officer at the Gallipoli landing, who would subsequently become the first director of the Australian War Memorial. What should we do to see that they are remembered? Bean conceived then the idea of a memorial, a museum, the finest one in the world as he would envision it, for these men of the AIF and the women as nurses. He returned to Australia and convinced the federal government to pass an act that would give effect to it, to reassure those that were fighting and dying on the Western Front and Sinai, Palestine and other theatres throughout the world, that they would indeed be remembered. As Jane mentioned in her introduction, I had 3 years in Europe. I served as Australia's ambassador to Belgium and Luxembourg and NATO and the European Union and did a lot of things. But of all of the things that I had the privilege to do there, it was the time that I spent in the cemeteries and at the Menin Gate in Ypres that I most appreciated. And I know Mal Brough and Bob Baldwin will appreciate me saying this, given the experiences they have had with this. But when I became Minister for Defence, it changed my attitude to life and what I regard as being really important. For those of you who don't know, the Menin Gate is at Ypres. Ypres was completely destroyed in the First World War. It's in Flanders, in Belgium. At the end of the First World War, the British were thinking, well, how do we recognise and record the names of those men who were killed and bodies were never found? And so it was conceived a magnificent stone arch on the medieval wall around Ypres over the Menin Road. And into it are inscribed the names of 55,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers who were killed and bodies never found. The other 35,000 who couldn't fit on the Menin Gate are at the back of the Tynecott Cemetery, about a 10-minute drive down the road, where there are 12,000 graves, including 1,369 Australians, including 2 Victoria Cross recipients. I used to go to the Menin Gate a lot. In fact, as an aside, and as accountants you might appreciate this, I'd been in Brussels about 3 months, and the Menin Gate is about an hour and a half drive from Brussels. And my then deputy came into my office and she closed the door, which is always a serious sign. She said, "Brendan, I think we've got a problem." And I said, "Oh, what's that?" She said, "I've just had a look at how much we're spending on wreaths." She said, "We've spent more on wreaths in 3 months than your predecessors spent in 3 years." I said, "Really?" She said, "Yeah, you're going to the Menin Gate a lot." And I said, "Oh, really? Do you think we might have a scandal?" And she said, "Yeah, that's what I'm worried about." And I said, "Well, let's hope it's front page." I said, "If I go to the Menin Gate every single night that I'm here for 3 years and I lay a wreath, I still won't even get to 1 in 6 Australian names that are on it, 6,169 of them. And Australian taxpayers are very cautious about how their taxes are spent. But I think they like to see those green and gold wreaths that have a ribbon across it that says, 'Laid on behalf of the Australian people.'" Everybody is different when they go to these places, and if you have had the privilege to go, and it is a privilege, everyone looks for different things. Andrew related part of his own experiences in going to Gallipoli. When I went to these places, I prefer to actually go not when major events are on. And when I go, I like to just quietly wander around and have a look at the headstones, and what I look for is the epitaphs. At the end of the First World War, the families were given the opportunity to have an epitaph on the bottom of the headstone. Until 1926, they had to pay for each letter. Some families were so deeply distressed and angry about it they didn't want to know anything. Many simply couldn't afford it, and others made extraordinary sacrifices or had the means to put an epitaph on them. One in particular that to me says a great deal is that of Private I.D. Hart. I subsequently learned Private Ian Hart, and he was 30 years old. He was killed on the 27th of November 1916. He's buried at the Guards Cemetery in Arras, which is just off the Somme. I learned that it was his mother who wrote the epitaph at her kitchen table for a grave that she would never see. "I gave my son, he gave his all, his life for Australia and empire." Private T.R. Webb is buried in Bethlehem West Cemetery in Flanders. His father chose the words for his grave: "To live in the hearts of those we leave behind is never to die." When I was informed, having applied for this job as Director of the Australian War Memorial and gone through a process and interview and so on, but when I was informed by the then Secretary of the Department of Veterans Affairs that I was going to be appointed Director of the Australian War Memorial, I confided in 3 people to whom I'm close, not former political colleagues, and one of them said to me, he said, "I can't believe you're doing that." He said, "You're wasting your life." He said, "You've got far more important things to do for Australia than rearrange its history." And I said to him, "Well, if you can find something you're passionate about and get paid for it, isn't that mission accomplished? But more importantly, this has much, much more to do with our future than it does our past." T.S. Eliot wrote in 1942, which I regard as the most important year in Australia's history after 1788. He wrote, "A people without history is not redeemed from time, for history is a pattern of endless moments." Charles Bean, the founder of the memorial, the official historian, articulated the vision for the memorial in 1948. What differentiates leadership from management is vision. Management's about making decisions, emptying an inbox or an in-tray in the process, but what informs leadership is vision, a comprehensive sense of who we are, where we want to go and why we want to get there. Bean's vision for the memorial to which we remain true is this: here is their spirit, in the heart of the land they loved, and here we guard the record which they themselves made. One of the paradoxes that I've observed as I've gone through my life of us as human beings is that it's very tempting to settle for the broad brushstrokes of our history, from the comfortable distance of the lives that we now live, and the things that perhaps need to be imposed upon our nation, about which we'll hear tomorrow night, are absolutely nothing compared to what our forebears have been through to give us what we have and make us who we are. But it's very tempting to just settle for the broad brushstrokes: 62,000 killed in the First World War, or a Gallipoli landing and a lesser number of people knowing much about France or Belgium or Sinai, Palestine, or the war at sea. We cannot allow the past to become a distant stranger. None of us can allow ourselves to, in neglectful ignorance, to forget individual sacrifices that have been made in our name. Private Hart, Private Webb, and the other 62,000, their mothers, their fathers, their wives, their children, we have a responsibility to them to remember their individual sacrifices and to understand how these cataclysmic events changed our nation, but in the longer term gave us a more confident sense of our own story and who we are. Consistent with that, there are a lot of things we're doing at the memorial for the centenary of the First World War, and I won't go through them all. But amongst them, and consistent with this, we have commenced what we call the last post ceremony. I went to the Menin Gate. They play the last post at the Menin Gate every night, and they have done so since 1927 when it opened. At 8 o'clock, the last post is played. In fact, on my last night in Belgium, my wife and I went there again. And the chairman of the Last Post Association, who organises it all, Benoit Motry, leaned over and said to me, "Ambassador, this is your 73rd visit." And I said, "What are you counting them?" And he said, "Well, we weren't at first, but we realised you were coming quite a lot, so we started counting. And we've counted 73. I said, "Benoit, if it was in Brussels, I would have gone every night." But I often stood under that Menin Gate and I looked up at those names. And when you are there, as I know Bob Baldwin has been, when you are there and you are facing the arch which is opposite you, there are two large Australian panels on the sandstone that's actually facing you, and then those Australian names go up inside the arch, up the stairs, all the way around the back, around the side, around the back, and almost down to the other side again. But I often ask myself, why don't they tell us about one of these people? Who were they? So every night now at their war memorial, what we do is at 5 minutes to 5, we have a lectern, which is just down from the Hall of Memory, the dome part of the memorial, about which I'll speak in a moment. And we have our MC reminds the audience of the vision of Charles Bean in the origins of the memorial. We sing the national anthem. We have an Australian flag. We have a uniformed serving member of the Defence Force there every night. We have a piper plays the lament whilst wreaths and floral tributes are laid, and the cards on those are kept and archived in perpetuity. Then we read the story behind one of those men or women from the Boer War to Afghanistan. Who was this person? Where were they born? Where did they grow up? What did they do? How did they join the military? And then how did they die for us? The ode is then recited, the last post is played, and all of it is broadcast live on a webcam. There are 102,763 Australian names on the Roll of Honour, those bronze panels, from the First World War through to and including Afghanistan, and also a year ago we changed the policy to also add the names of those men and women who have given their lives for us in our uniform in peacekeeping, humanitarian, disaster relief and other operations, whose lives are no less worthy of recognition in bronze panels than those who've given their lives in circumstances of war. The purpose of doing this is to see that Australians are reminded that every one of those names is a person, And where we have a photograph, we exhibit the photograph all day in the entrance to the memorial, and we put it next to the pool of reflection when the last post is occurring. I go as often as I can, usually 4 nights a week. We've had, they're all moving, but just to give you an idea of one of them, Robert Page was born in 1922. He was doing his first year of medicine at Sydney University in 1940. He left university and joined the Army, the 2nd 4th Pioneers. He transferred to Z Special, the origins of the SAS, and he was in the first JWIC raid, the raid on Singapore Harbour in 1942, and they destroyed or sank 7 Japanese ships, having Page paddled with 5 other blokes 40 kilometres to do the job, and he returned to Australia. He married the love of his life, Roma, on the 1st of November 1942. In 1943, he was on the 2nd raid, which ended up being a disaster, and he was one of those that was turned in, one of the 10 turned in and beheaded by the Japanese. His wife, Roma, his widow, never remarried. She lives here in Canberra. We did Bob's last post, and she came to the last post ceremony with flowers from their wedding cake. She said to me, "You cannot imagine what this means to me." We're well advanced, as I mentioned earlier, in the redevelopment of our First World War galleries. Many of you would be familiar with them the way they were. We will tell the origins of the war, the way Australia changed through the course of the war. The dioramas will be in chronological order. They've been fully restored. There's a very modern lighting technology, LED lighting technology we're applying to them. We're also going to have a visitor audio experience, a very large multimedia flat screen, which will be before you get to the First World War galleries, and we'll provide our own tablets to enable people to draw down extra information that they want to have as they go through the galleries. There will be multilingual guide for people to follow. We will tell the story of the outbreak of the war, enlistment, embarkation, Egypt, France, Belgium, Palestine, Sinai, the war at sea, the Hindenburg Line. There will be much more than previously the story of the cost of the war at the individual level, as well as the larger broad brushstrokes, as I said. And when people emerge from it, I'm absolutely convinced that they will have a deep sense of pride, but not a shallow jingoistic one, but one which is infused by a sober understanding of the cost of this war to our nation. We're also building a $70 million travelling exhibition for the centenary. That will be subject to Mr Fox and his fundraising activities with the corporate sector, which seems to be going reasonably well. But we're going to travel our Mark IV tank, the A7V Mephisto from Queensland, a 9.2 howitzer, an 18-pounder. We're using a 3,500 square metre pavilion pentaspan technology. We'll travel 250 items or objects from our own collection. We'll use multimedia to present a whole range of stories, including a century of service, and there'll be a commemorative component as a part of the travelling exhibition. And in the 35 communities that it will go to, individual RSLs and communities will be able to present their own exhibition based around what they have in their own communities. And we'll also run an antique roadshow style of thing for people to bring their artefacts in and have an expert explain to them what they're all about. On the 4th of August this year, the centenary of the commencement of the war, 2 things will happen at the memorial that night. The first is that we will turn on a switch, and in the First World War cloister, as you walk along the Roll of Honour, you will hear these young voices of students 10, 11 and 12 years of age from schools the length and breadth of Australia, reciting the name and age of death of each one of the 62,000. We're working with the ABC, and Google has produced a web-based app for us that will enable schools to log in and kids to sit in front of the computer and download 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 names and age of death. Already in the schools that we've gone to, teachers have usually said, let's find something out about these young men. So the speaker technology that's being installed is one that doesn't project, but you hear it clearly when you are close to it. And so you'll walk along this First World War cloister and hear these voices. John Stannon Luff, age 27. Robert John Forsyth, age 19. Thomas White, age 29. The second thing we'll do on the 4th is we will turn another switch on, and onto the front of the memorial, just below the dome on the horizontal concrete pillar, will be projected every night for 4 years the name of each one of the 62,000. Each name will be up there for 30 seconds and be projected on 19 occasions over the 4 years. It'll be visible down Anzac Parade, and people will be able to go to our website and they will be able to find when the name of the person in whom they have an interest is going to be projected. Not long after I arrived in Belgium, I received a letter, and the letterhead was Sons of the British Empire. Set me back a bit, and the letter was written by a man called Peter Pickering from Hobart, Tasmania. And this organisation, Sons of the British Empire, was basically people who describe themselves as living historians. And what they do is dress up in First World War Australian uniforms, and they would go to schools and speak to senior primary students about sacrifice on the Western Front. They had made their own wooden crosses, small crosses, in their own backyard sheds. And then the kids would write their name and school on one side and what it all means to them on the other. He wrote me this letter and said, look, I can't get anybody to support me with this. The Tasmanian government won't give me $500. I went to the Department of Veterans Affairs. They said, go away. Is there anything you can do? And I said, okay. So I wrote back to this guy and I said, oh, all right, I'm happy to be a patron if that helps. I sent him $500. And I said, you send me the crosses and I'll get them onto Australian graves. The end result of that is that at the end of the dawn service at Polygon Wood, the 5th Division Memorial is at Polygon Wood, again in Flanders. There are 564 Australians buried there. The Australians came forward and took one of these small crosses off the stone of sacrifice and then walked through the early morning light to find an Australian grave and had to make a decision about which Australian grave they'd put it on. And some people were very emotional when they read the messages these kids had written and take photographs of them and send them back to the kid. Peter Pickering died in February this year at the age of 47, leaving his wife and 2 young boys. And I spoke to him 3 days before his death and I said, Peter, you've achieved more in your less than half century than many people achieve if they live to be 100. I'm determined to see this legacy is going to live. I told him that we at the memorial had already ordered 100,000 crosses. And we've also already negotiated for those crosses to be placed in this way on Australian graves in 39 countries. And already as we speak, that's precisely what is happening. There are many other things that we are doing in terms of digitisation and a whole variety of projects to give a sense of meaning in terms of these commemorations. I just say by way of conclusion, and then I'm happy to answer any questions. For those of you who are familiar with it, the Australian War Memorial is unique. It's a museum and it's an archive, but it's also a shrine, a place of remembrance. And the Hall of Memory, which is the dome-like structure, that beautiful Byzantine Art Deco architecture, which is at the centre of the memorial, within that is the tomb of the unknown Australian soldier. And there are 15 stained glass windows around that Hall of Memory. At the end of the First World War, Charles Bean, John Treloar, who'd become the first director, and the army historian, sought to distill the values or the qualities that they had seen in these men and women as nurses that they regarded not only as being essential for success in battle, but also depth and breadth of character. And each stained glass window has the image of an Australian serviceman, of the First World War and of a nurse. And at the bottom of each one is enshrined one of these values, one of these qualities: resource, candour, devotion, curiosity, independence, comradeship, ancestry, patriotism, chivalry, loyalty, coolness, control, audacity, and decision. What we are determined to do in the leadership of the memorial, as distinct from its management, is to remain true to Bean's vision, but to ensure that Australians, and young Australians in particular, looking for a sense of meaning and purpose, what does it mean to be an Australian, are finding increasingly our story of what it means to be an Australian as being in the values that they see in these men and women, and differentiating that from the madness, as they see it, of some of the wars in which Australia has been involved, and certainly quite a few of the battles. In my view, young people, instead of embracing values for the world they think they're going to get, imagine being 15 or 16 growing up in this country today. You would be forgiven for thinking that mistrust, cynicism, materialism, impatience, that these are the kind of things that are going to give you what you think you're going to get. But for the world they want, they need look no further than those qualities which can be redefined perhaps in a modern kind of language, which is one that is able to reach out to all Australians. So I must say that when I was in Europe, I dealt with a lot of Europeans, many of them very flaky, and I said at one stage to one of the leaders of one of the nation states in Western Europe, we're having a discussion about Asia, and I said, look, one thing that's really important is you don't prosecute foreign policy into Asia predicated predominantly on Western ideology and a preoccupation with human rights. If you do, not only will you fail, you'll alienate these countries in the region. But the one thing that's absolutely essential, you've got to be clear, you've got to be steadfast about your own values and who you are. It's not until you go into the Australian War Memorial, where the soul of the nation resides, as distinct from the political capital on the other side of the lake, and you look at the names in bronze of where Australians have fought and died over 100 years, and as the Turkish Chief of Air Force asked me last year, when he pointed to one of them, he asked, why were Australians there? And I said, that's a very important question, because in your journey of discovery, you will then know who we are and what makes us tick. Because those values that are enshrined in that hall of memory, the fundamental ethos of those 2 million men and women who wear and have worn the uniform of our three services, underwrite in a very significant way who we are and how we see ourselves in the world. Thank you very much.